Tonight on Primetime Politics, reporting failures.
I think there has been a lot of improvement over the last number of years.
Evidence of Chinese interference was detected in federal elections, but disagreements about their dangers prevented the intelligence from getting to the Prime Minister. Coming up, we'll dig into a new report from Canada's intelligence watchdog. And the politics of beer. We'll tell you why the expansion of alcohol sales may trigger an early election in Ontario. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. The independent body that oversees intelligence in this country is raising serious concerns, worried about security threats and how they are communicated to the Prime Minister. In reviewing CSIS reports from 2018 to 2023, the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency says there is consensus Canada was a target of foreign interference and the People's Republic of China a major perpetrator. But reports of individual threats did not always make it to the Prime Minister's desk, and that's because there was disagreement between CSIS and the Prime Minister's National Security and Intelligence Advisor about how serious individual threats were. The watchdog agency is now making recommendations, and here is what we heard today from the Public Safety Minister in response.
The Prime Minister directed a year and a half ago that there be a broader sharing of intelligence information with ministers responsible, and I have noticed myself the extent to which different pieces of intelligence are tracked in terms of who saw what when. So those improvements have been largely in place for some time, but we're certainly happy to look at the report, obviously, in detail and ensure that the recommendations are enacted.
Well, to talk about this report, we're now joined by security analyst Christian Leuprecht. He's also a professor at both the Royal Military College and Queen's University and the author of Intelligence as Democratic Statecraft, published by Oxford University Press. Christian, always good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Michael, my pleasure. Hello.
Hello. Listen, I want to begin our discussion here by reminding people what we heard from Justice Og, because in her interim report on foreign interference, she wrote that she had not seen any evidence to suggest Canadian officials were acting in bad faith, but what she had seen suggested information did not get to where it was intended and or not properly understood. Add to that now this report from the intelligence watchdog, and it seems to back up, if not give us details about what Justice Hogue was trying to get at. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, so these are clearly issues of information flows, and we know that these are pervasive, but we know that given the rapidly changing threat environment, other democracies have taken very proactive measures to improve precisely those flows, to make sure that the right people have the right information at the right time. Australia and the United Kingdom deliberately restructured their intelligence flows at the senior levels. Canada, of course, has not. And so we see here precisely those significant, very high transaction costs, and that the right information did not get to the right people at the right time. And so these are issues that ultimately you're not going to solve by legislation. These are issues you're going to solve by paying attention to your bureaucracy and posturing your bureaucracy more effectively. One of the key takeaways is that security and intelligence just doesn't get a lot of bandwidth when it comes to probably the Prime Minister's office, because otherwise, if it had been a priority, people would have noticed much earlier that they're not getting the information that they wanted, or they weren't getting it in the right time or in the right format. At the same time, of course, look, ultimately, the responsibility lies with the government of the day. We live in a Westminster system of government under ministerial responsibility. So there's ultimately the minister of the day when it comes to CSIS, the public safety minister, and when it comes to the Privy Council office, the Prime Minister, who's responsible for what's happening within their departments. And so in this particular case, we can simply say clearly this was, again, not a priority for the Prime Minister or the minister that were responsible for that bureaucracy. But of course, it's not unusual that we have discrepancies between what intelligence agencies in democracy think is important and what the government of the day says is important. We live in a democracy, and so it's ultimately up to the government of today to judge what intelligence matters to them, whether they're going to action it, and when they're going to action it. And so the government ultimately needs to answer for that.
Well, the report does recommend that everyone come up with a common working understanding of what political foreign interference is, because whether or not this was prioritized, as you say, the report points to this disconnect between what CSIS considered was of note and what the National Security Advisor, Intelligence Advisor had to say about it. How easy would it be to come up with some type of common definition so that they could trigger to know, yes, this is of concern?
Well, our understanding and definition of national security in this country dates back to the CSIS Act of 1984, 40 years ago, when we were still in the Cold War. And so, again, this points to the fact that we have national security frameworks, definitions, concepts that are wholly outdated, that no government has felt it necessary to update. And as you point out, it's difficult to get agencies on the same page when we don't have a common definition of foreign interference, we don't have a common understanding, and so necessarily we shouldn't be surprised that not only different departments and agencies interpret it differently, but that also the bureaucracy and the government of the day interpret it differently.
Well, and add to that the challenge of sharing the information, because it was also noted here that CSIS struggled to report their concerns because they were worried that they'd be interfering in the election process. What type of challenges that create for any agency then?
Well, CSIS provides its best capability of an intelligence. CSIS provides its best sort of ability to provide the intelligence of the day, but ultimately it is not CSIS's job to provide policy recommendations. So we have an intelligence assessment, and it is up then to the Privy Council office and the Prime Minister to see what it is that they ultimately want to do with that assessment. It appears that there are serious translation issues, shall we say, between what CSIS is trying to communicate, how that is being appreciated within its own bureaucracy, and then how that is being fed up and translated to both political staffers as well as the government of the day. And so again, it suggests on the one hand, perhaps unfamiliarity with the security and intelligence community, how that community needs to operate itself and communicate with itself, and how it needs to communicate with its political masters. And again, that points to the fact that security and intelligence just hasn't been a particularly high priority, because otherwise we would have discovered these issues much earlier and tried to lower some of the collective action issues that we're now discovering.
Well, you say fast track there, or prioritizing there, and the federal government has introduced Bill C-70 to deal with foreign interference. And today we heard from the Conservatives, they are proposing to fast track Bill C-70 through the House. They want to see this foreign interference legislation pass before the next vote. What do you make of that proposal on behalf of the Conservatives?
So inherently, it's in the interest of our democracy to see these measures postured more robustly. These are changes that the government itself introduced after consultation, both internal and external. And I think the opposition is throwing down the gauntlet for the government to see, is the government actually serious about passing legislation it has introduced, or is this simply performative posturing by the government? So I think it'll be very interesting how the government responds to that, and also, of course, how the other parties in Parliament will respond to that. It's one thing, as we know, to have a bill that everybody can agree on in principle. It's very different to have wording in that bill that everybody can ultimately agree on.
Well, we certainly are watching here in Ottawa. But Christian, I always appreciate the time. As always, thank you for that.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, time now for a look at what else happened in politics today. The federal government has reached a deal with Ontario that will unlock $357 million for housing projects. A deal had been reached earlier under the federal government's housing initiative, but the Trudeau Liberals withheld that money, concerned about Ontario's ability to build the affordable units it promised. The concerns have now apparently been addressed.
What's most important from my perspective is the obligations Ontario agreed to under the initial agreement will be met. We had some challenges getting there with the new affordable housing units that they had committed to, which we had very serious reservations would not actually be built. Those reservations have been addressed with the change in approach and reorientation of investments by the province.
Ottawa is increasing the number of Palestinians who will be allowed in the country. The federal government raising the cap to 5,000 applicants, 4,000 more than initially planned. The program will reunite Palestinians with family members already here in Canada. But reunification has been difficult. Currently, there is no way for people to leave the Gaza region. The embattled Speaker of the House of Commons appeared before committee today. Greg Fergus answering questions about policies on harassment and violence in Parliament. But questions were quickly asked about the Speaker's neutrality and his past actions as an MP. That too became an issue. In 2016, Fergus defended the Prime Minister who allegedly elbowed NDP MP Ellen Brosseau in the chamber. Fergus started to answer the question but was interrupted.
Yet in the moment when you had an opportunity as a peer in the House of Commons to give a woman space and hear her argument out, your exact words were this: what happened was exactly as the Prime Minister had described it. If I came in and I said, this happened with a Liberal member or a Conservative member, whose side would you take?
I would clearly want to make sure that the process was entirely fair and that your story and that your concerns would be raised and pursued to the fullest possible extent.
How can I have that assurance?
That could happen.
How can I have that assurance when you've had three clear instances of being partisan while in the chair?
And finally, Ontario New Democrat MPP Saul Mamakwa made history today, becoming the first member of the provincial legislature to ask questions in a language other than English or French. Mamakwa, who is a member of the Kingfisher Lake First Nation, asked the Premier about long-term care beds in his riding, all in Oji Cree.
Will the government finally come through on their 2018 promise to create 76 more long-term care beds in Sioux Lookout? When?
The Ontario Premier noted the historic moment and said the province will build a long-term care home in the riding. And a programming note, Saul Mamakwa will be on our program later this week. Well, a provincial election may be brewing in Ontario sooner than voters expected. Last week, the province announced that beer and wine sales will be coming to the province's corner stores sooner than expected, just after Labor Day rather than in 2026. And by Halloween, big box retailers and supermarkets who are not already part of the action will get a chance to sell it as well.
The monopoly with the three big breweries, they're done, they're gone. We're going to make sure it's convenient for people and be treated like everyone else in the country. Be treated like everyone else down in the U.S., North America, everywhere. You can walk into a store and pick up a can of beer, a case of beer, a bottle of wine, ready to drink. And that's why we're doing it. We're keeping our promise, and we're going to move forward on this. And it's overwhelmingly popular. Overwhelmingly. I've never seen numbers this high before.
Well, to talk about how this move is triggering speculation about an early vote, we're now joined by two journalists who cover Ontario politics. Martin Regg Cohn is a political columnist with the Toronto Star, and Sabrina Nanji is a journalist and the woman behind the Queen's Park Observer, the founder of it. Hello to both of you.
Hi.
Hi there.
So, Martin, I'll begin with you, because, this discussion may seem odd to some viewers out there, because in other parts of the country, you can get beer and wine at the corner store. Not in Ontario, not yet, at least not now. But how does this decision trigger all these election rumors?
Well, go ahead and make fun of Ontario. A lot of us do, but it's not as weird as it used to be. Without going into a history lesson, about a decade ago, I started to pay attention to this weirdness of the beer store that everybody thought was owned by the government, and it's not. It was actually, and still is, a private consortium owned by three big brewers, Labatt's, Anheuser-Busch, and Molson and Coors, and what happened, though, is that in 2015-16, the last Liberal government kind of broke that stranglehold and started to phase in for 10 years a deal whereby the beer store and the LCBO would not have the stranglehold, and it could be sold in supermarkets, in big box retailers. And Doug Ford came along in 2018 and said, oh, this is terrible. This deal is not good enough. We're going to rip up this deal, and we're going to instead allow every corner store to have stale beer. Well, he didn't say stale beer, or a small selection of just a handful of beers. He didn't say that. But he said, I'm going to bring you beer in convenience stores. And guess what? Nobody really cared. And he said in that clip that the numbers are through the roof. You can get beer and wine and cider in a lot of places now, in a lot of big supermarkets. And the question is, why is Doug Ford doing this now when that 10-year framework agreement, that contract, is still in force and which required him to actually hold his horses and wait and wait and wait. And now, a year ahead of schedule, he's moving ahead with this deal and paying the big brewers hundreds of millions of dollars. And the only question is, why would he do that? What's the obsession for our teetotaling premier? And the speculation is, and the indications are, that he is toying with the idea of an early election.
Okay, Sabrina, I'm going to ask you to build on that, because we heard it there from Martin. The premier doesn't even drink beer. He doesn't drink alcohol at all. But back in 2018, when he was first elected, he was promising $1 a beer. What is the whole politics around alcohol and beer in Ontario, and why is it triggering this early vote speculation?
Yeah, I think Martin did a good job of laying out our weird history of alcohol sales in Ontario. But you're right, this is something straight out of Doug Ford's populist playbook. Maybe he himself claims he doesn't drink, but this is something that, average everyday folks are going to be happy about. And I think a lot of people beyond Ontario's borders are surprised to learn that you can't just go to, the corner store and grab a bottle of wine or a couple of beers. Like when you're in Quebec, you just go to Le Dépanneur, and it's very easy. But the thing is that 2018, when Doug Ford initially promised this, that was a bit of a different lay of the land, right? We've now had a pandemic behind us where, cost of living is very high. And so I think the big question is, how important is this? And, because this has fueled speculation about an early election, is this enough to keep Doug Ford in power? I'm not so sure about that on its own, but certainly the big question is, why spend, hundreds of millions to speed this up? And there are a lot of factors at play, and it would be, I think, politically advantageous for Doug Ford to go to the polls now. He's riding high in public opinion surveys. He's trounced, the Liberals, who have a new leader in Bonnie Crombie. She's still, getting her feet wet. She's still settling into her groove in the role. Marit Stiles and the NDP, the actual official opposition, are trailing in his dust. They're fresh off back-to-back by-election wins. And while they do have, a year of policy backtracks and this RCMP investigation into the Greenbelt hanging over his head, I do think that Doug Ford is leaning into that a little bit. He's spent millions of dollars not only attacking Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals, but also leaning into some of these policy reversals and backtracks and I guess gaffes that he's made over the this past year. I mean, he even says in his latest ad, you can't always get it right the first time. And I think that's, a human thing, that we all make mistakes. But then again, he is the premier of Ontario. And so I think we'll have to wait and see, if that's enough to keep him in power. A third mandate is very rare to win in Ontario, but certainly speeding up the beer store deal is one thing that is absolutely just dousing gasoline on these rumors of a potential early election. The premier himself said today on the radio, when he was asked, are we going to go to the polls earlier than our fixed election date in June 2026? And he said, stay tuned. So I think buckle up for folks in Ontario.
Okay, buckle up. Let's build upon that again then, Martin, because, how much of this has to do with the fact that, historically Ontarians seem to not want the same party in Queen's Park in Toronto and at the same time in Parliament in Ottawa. How much of this has to do with that type of reasoning?
Well, I know that's a conventional wisdom among political analysts. I personally have never believed that voters say to themselves, I love this Doug Ford guy, but now that Pierre Poilievre is in power, I'm going to vote out Doug Ford, or the reverse, or insert a name. I'm not sure voters are that calculating. I think it's worked out that way for various reasons. I don't think that's what's really motivating. That political science theory is what's motivating Doug Ford, if in fact the early election speculation comes to pass. I think he's worried, not about a change in party, but I think he's worried about Pierre Poilievre as prime minister. There is no love lost between these two leaders. They barely know each other. They barely speak to each other. And so there's no chemistry between them. I think Doug Ford is actually more comfortable privately and in public, where he shares the stage with Justin Trudeau. I think it's more that he's afraid that Pierre Poilievre, if he follows up the way he's talking, is going to make a lot of cuts and will download a lot of that onto the provinces, and Ontario would be a sitting duck. So there's that. There's also the possibility of the economy and affordability and housing promises causing Mr. Ford more problems. There is, as Sabrina mentioned, the fact that the opposition has no traction yet, but there's no evidence that they'll have traction down the road, even with two new leaders, two very able leaders. So what I think is missing in this equation is I'm not sure that providing beer in convenience stores, we used to call them corner stores, but they're not in every corner anymore. I'm not sure that this is something people care about. I think people thought the beer store was a pain in the butt when I first started writing about it a decade ago, and we're glad to retrench it. I don't think this is a vote winner, and so I think it's more of a peephole into Doug Ford's mind that he is obsessed with this issue, couldn't wait to let it for the 10-year agreement to run its course, and instead tried to preempt it, and is trying to get his ducks in a row. Mm-hmm. Just in case.
Yeah, and for people, just to almost a glossary of terms, in Ontario, you buy beer at the beer store. Quite literally, that is its name. So, Sabrina, I'm wondering, though, is there a danger in calling an early vote for Ford? Because, to get beer and wine sales into corner stores and supermarkets, you both talked about it. The province is paying $250 million to the privately run beer store itself as a penalty of sorts to wrap up their contract earlier. And the costs don't end there. Talk to us about the pitfalls of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to Martin's point, I don't know if this is going to be the thing that, you're going to be like, I love being able to go buy a beer around the corner, or maybe not a corner, literally, but I don't know if that's the thing that's going to get people out to the polls. But at the end of the day, Doug Ford has been in power since 2018, and there's a lot of ambitious promises that he's made, and you really can't ask Ontarians for a third mandate, whether that's earlier or, as scheduled in 2026, without showing some tangible progress on that. And so I do think that while this beer store, could end up costing us more in, rebates from the LCBO or having a 10% wholesale discount, there's a lot of, I guess, spin when it comes to the numbers. The Liberals are calling it $1 billion booze doggle, which is a bit of a mouthful. The government disputes that. But at the end of the day, I think that Doug Ford isn't going to go to the polls early until he can show some real progress on some of these really ambitious promises. Those are things like balancing the budget, building these controversial yet popular in some parts of the province, especially the 905 highways, the 413 and the Bradford bypass, and of course, liberalizing alcohol sales. And so I think, for all the talk about what the dynamics on the Hill and how that's going to affect things at Queen's Park, whether the opposition is really able to get their message out there. We've got a new leader in Bonnie Crombie that obviously has Doug Ford shaking in his boots. They're spending millions to attack her in new ad spots. I think that Doug Ford really needs to look at his own house and say, well, what's the justification for this? Because politically, it might be advantageous for Doug Ford to go to the polls early, but how do you justify that to the public beyond, this is self-serving? And, an early election could potentially cost a lot more for taxpayers. Elections Ontario might be scrambling, to get their ducks in a row before for an earlier vote. But, how does Doug Ford really justify this? Because he's still got a whopping majority, which is essentially carte blanche at Queen's Park. He can do whatever he wants. And so why does he need to go to the polls earlier beyond it being politically advantageous? I think that's the question he really needs to figure out if he really is thinking about going to the polls early. And potentially it could be that we have had a lot of policy reversals. We heard a lot from the public and we've made our mistakes, something he's already owning up to, and we need a fresh mandate from the public. So I think there's still a lot of challenges, but really he kind of needs to get his own house in order rather than looking at the opposition parties and on the Hill to really game this out for himself and his own prospects.
Okay, quickly losing time but quickly from both of you. Martin, I'll begin with you. If there were to be an early vote in Ontario, what are you hearing about a possible time frame?
Well, that's a good question. People are talking about the spring, but I wouldn't narrow it down to there. It could be any time sooner than you imagine. So we're now at we're now only roughly at the 2-year mark. So in the 3rd year of the mandate, it just honestly, no matter whether it's spring or before then or even a little bit after then, it just boggles the mind that when people are looking at long waiting lists in hospital for surgery times, long waiting lists for long waits to get into a house for housing or being able to afford a house, that, hey, I got beer in corner stores. I'm not sure that's going to really cut it for people.
Okay, Sabrina, what about time frame? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I'm hearing my sources have been telling me if we go, and it's a big if at this point, early, it's going to be spring 2025, because I think that's the point where a lot of progress will be made. They're talking about having shovels in the ground and construction going on the highways, potentially closer to budget balance, all that, good stuff that you want to go to the, put to the electorate. Personally, I am hoping we go early, because I think we already feels like we're in campaign mode at Queen's Park, and this is like a Super Bowl for us journalists. So I think it would be really exciting, and I'm not sure if I can go for 2 years talking about what if and what's going to happen. So that's just my personal speculation, but of course it's just speculation at this point.
Okay, well we'll put a request note to the Premier for you. Sabrina would like an earlier vote. Martin Regg Cohn, Sabrina Nanji, thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
Thanks.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Tuesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow night. Until then, take care.